All right. Well, hey, good evening. Welcome to the passage. We're we have 3 weeks left in the book of Genesis, and this week and next week we're going to complete the story of Joseph. And so I've entitled it "Trusting God's Providence," Part 1, and Part 2 will be next week. When you think about the story of Joseph, it's really all about God working behind the scenes. And actually, we've been quite accustomed to doing, looking at some of that in Scripture, whether it be the story of Esther or here with the story of Joseph. It's all about God's providence. Someone has likened our lives as a puzzle that requires our trust and faith in God to place the pieces in their proper positions. And so this and next week's lessons may demonstrate that truth, kind of showing how it all comes together. We left off with Joseph being sold into slavery and the things that he's gone through there, and then interpreting the dreams of not only the cupbearer, but also of Pharaoh. And so perhaps even for Joseph, he's starting to see how the pieces are falling into place. And so that's this week and next week we're going to be looking at the story of Joseph. The final week in this book of beginnings, Genesis, will be an examination of Judah, the fourth son of Jacob, born to him by Leah. And so we're going to be examining Judah and his leadership role among the sons of Israel. Have you ever wondered why Jesus is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah? Well, this section of Scripture will allow us to explore the reason for that title, as well as look at the character of the fourth son of Jacob and why he has leadership among or above his brothers. So that'll be in 2 weeks. That'll be the final week of our time in the book of Genesis. And so now we want to turn our attention to Trusting God's Providence, Part 1. And we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 42, verse 1 through 45, verse 24. And so we begin with famine and a trip to Egypt. If you remember, Pharaoh had a dream, and Joseph interpreted that dream. Well, Pharaoh's dreams and Joseph's interpretations have been confirmed. And so we're actually going to begin back in chapter 41, verse 56, to kind of give us a setting for what we're dealing with. And there in 56 it says, "When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the world." And then chapter 42, verse 1 reads this way: "When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, 'Why do you just keep looking at each other?'" I can only picture. Why are you just sitting there? Okay. I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die. And so here they are in the midst of famine, in the midst of tragedy, if you will, and in the midst of trouble. And Jacob actually looks at his sons and said, "What are you going to do about this? I've heard there's grain in Egypt, so go there and get it." And it says then in verse 3, then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. All right. So I just want you to notice, Pharaoh's dreams and Joseph's interpretations have been confirmed. It's happening. In fact, we learn later on they are in the second year of the famine. And so it's been several years. In fact, some believe that it's been as many as 20 years since Joseph's brothers have seen him. And that's really important as we get into the story, that they don't recognize him, but he recognizes them, because if you remember, they were adults when they sold him into slavery. And so now Joseph has grown up, and they just simply don't recognize him. But notice that God is bringing events full circle. And so Jacob sends his sons to Egypt. That's what we've just read about. But verse 4 tells us, and if you noticed as we read it, it says 10 of Joseph's brothers. There were 12 total, 11 brothers. There's one who's missing out of this, and verse 4 reveals to us that Jacob would not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others because he was afraid that harm might come to him. This is an important aspect that we'll get into a little later. Some details that we need to share. But just notice that he's refusing to send Benjamin, Joseph's brothers, with him because he's afraid something will happen. And so that brings us to Genesis 42, verses 6 through 28. Joseph's dream confirmed. If you remember back in chapter 37, Joseph had a dream. He had a couple of dreams. One was that they were out in the field. They were sheaves in a field, and Joseph, his sheaves stood upright, or was upright, and 11 other sheaves, representing his brothers, gathered around him and bowed down. The second dream that he had was that the sun and the moon and the stars actually bowed down before him. And so what I want you to know is that when these 10 brothers went down, or went up to Egypt from Canaan, went down from Canaan to Egypt, verse 6 says that Joseph was the governor of all the land, the one who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, now catch this, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. And so notice that Joseph's brothers now actually fulfill or confirm that dream, and they are bowing down before him, according to verse 6 of Genesis 42. Now, at this time, Joseph recognizes his brothers, and so verse 7 tells us, as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger, and he spoke harshly to them. I mean, you think? It's like, why wouldn't he speak harshly to them? He says, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan." And verse 8 reveals that although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. And then he remembered his dreams. Now, this is an important, verse here. Because right after, in verse 9, it says he remembered his dreams about them. It says that he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." And I've got to tell you, even though he recognizes his brothers and accuses them of being spies in this section, verses 7 through 12 of Genesis 42, Joseph is actually beginning to test them a little bit. It's not so much that he wants them to be punished anymore. I want to go back to verse 9 again. Then he remembered his dreams. You know, when Joseph originally shared with his brothers and with his father and his mother that they would bow down before him, I think he understood there was nothing malicious with that. And so a part of what's happening within Joseph is he's beginning to try to understand God's providence and all this, how God is in control and how God has a plan. And I honestly think that it's this interruption, he remembered his dreams, that actually causes Joseph to not want to take revenge on his brothers. Can I just be honest with you? In that kind of situation where, I mean, he's stripped of his coat, the coat that he was proud of, the coat that identified him as his father's favorite. He's thrown into a pit. Remember when I also said they probably beat him up a little bit. And they throw him into the pit. And then he can probably hear them talking about what they're going to do. Some of them want to kill him. Others are saying, no, let's not kill him. Judah finally says, what are we going to profit from killing him? Let's actually get a little profit. Let's sell him into slavery. And Joseph, I'm sure, remembers all of that conversation. And he certainly remembers being sold to the Ishmaelites, and then enduring what he did in Potiphar's house, and enduring what he did when he was in prison, and finally being lifted to this position. He remembered his dreams. He remembered that God had gifted him with this ability to not only dream but also interpret dreams, and he's starting to see God's plan in all of this. At the same time, he's wondering about his younger brother, so he begins to ask them in this text of chapter 42. He begins to ask them about family. Is your father? Do you have a father? Yeah, yes, he's still alive. What about any other brothers? Yeah, there's one. There's one that's gone. When they say that there's one who is gone, they're talking about Joseph. There's one who is no more. That's Joseph. And then they say then there's a younger brother who's still there at home. And so understand that Joseph tests his brothers by demanding that they bring Benjamin back to him. And that's in verses 19 and 20. He says to them, if you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me so that your words may be verified and that you may not die. And so it says this they proceeded to do. They said to one another, surely we're being punished because of our brother. Which brother? Joseph. Surely we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us. And then Reuben speaks up. Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we have to give an accounting for his blood. And they did not realize that Joseph could understand them. And what was happening is Joseph was using an interpreter, and he was doing that on purpose. It's all a part of the test of his brothers. And so, again, it says here, verse 24, you got to understand, Joseph is seeing his brothers for the first time, and he's trying to keep all this together. He is the most powerful man in the world, and now his accusers, the ones who have condemned him, the ones who have sold him, are standing before him. And so verse 24 of chapter 42 says that he turned away from them and began to weep. What's he crying about? Because he now knows that Reuben, remember Reuben? Reuben didn't want, he was going to come back and rescue him. The oldest brother was going to come back and rescue him. But by the time he got back, Joseph had already been sold into slavery. So verse 24 says that Joseph turned away from them and began to weep, but then turned back and spoke to them again. And he had Simeon taken from them. Simeon is the second born to Jacob. And so Simeon is taken from them. He's bound before their eyes. And so Joseph sends them home. And as he's sending them home, it's kind of interesting that he put the silver that was meant to pay for the grain back in each one of their sacks. I mean, that's how we know Joseph isn't out for revenge. He's understanding that this is all part of God's plan. And so Genesis 42, verses 29 through 38, I kind of call that in your notes an idol confirmed. Okay, because when they go back home and they begin to tell their father Jacob what happened to them in Egypt. Now let's kind of go over that a little bit. They arrive there and they meet Joseph. They bow down before Joseph. that confirms the dream that he had from the very beginning. And it's a dream that his brothers hated him for. Will we actually bow down before you? Well, yes, they did. They bowed down and they honored him in that way. Um, and so the brothers are relaying the story from the man. That's what they call him, the man in Egypt, which is actually Joseph. And so they relay the story. He accused us of being spies. In fact, he's kept Simeon until we bring Benjamin back to him. And so I just want to read part of this section, verse 33. Then the man who is Lord over the land said to us, "This is how I will know whether you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me," which was Simeon, "and take food for your starving households and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, so I will know that you are not spies, but honest men. Then I will give your brother back to you, and you can trade in the land." Now, in verse 35, it says, "As they were emptying their sacks, there in each man's sack was his pouch of silver. When they and their father saw the money pouches, they were frightened." Because they're probably thinking that when they go back, they're going to be accused of not paying for the grain, and not only accused of not paying for the grain, but of actually stealing their own money back, which is not what Joseph really intended. Verse 36 says, "Their father Jacob said to them, 'You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me.'" I mean, absolutely, crisis here, I guess. Jacob in verse 38 says, "My son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in sorrow." Now, if you'll remember, I titled this little section, "An Idol Confirmed." And we know that the brothers have relayed the story from Joseph, or from the man they call him in Egypt. And Jacob is refusing to send Benjamin to Egypt. Now, I think we have to take a little bit of time here to ask the question, why? Why won't he send Benjamin? All right, so let's back up a little bit. We're told in chapter 37, well, we can even back up farther than that. When Jacob went to the land of his forefathers to gain a wife, and he meets his wife, this woman named Rachel. And Rachel is the one, he works for Laban for 7 years to gain Rachel. He is in love with Rachel. And instead, after 7 years, Laban tricks him and gives him Leah and asks him to work another 7 years for Rachel. But you got to understand, so he has Leah as his wife first, but then he receives Rachel, and he loves Rachel. For years, Rachel is barren, and then she finally bears him 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. And we already know, according to chapter 37, that Joseph is his favorite. He's so much a favorite that he gives him this special gift, the coat of many colors, this robe, this colorful robe. And so Joseph is confirmed as being his favorite. Now Joseph is no more. And if you remember that as Benjamin was being born, Rachel dies. So the love of Jacob's life has died, and he's taken his affection and placed it on the older son of Rachel, Joseph. And now Joseph is no more. Jacob is hanging on to Benjamin because he is the last link to Rachel. And honestly, what has happened is Benjamin has become an idol to Jacob. He is not about to let Benjamin go. All right, and so uh, Judah speaks to his father, and that's Genesis 43, 1 through 15. And I want you to first notice Reuben's offer. Remember, Reuben has kind of been one who's tried to come to the rescue, but it's almost like he's a day late, a dollar short every time. And then I want you to hear his offer and figure why Jacob would reject his offer, Reuben's offer. In chapter 42, verse 37, it says that Reuben said to his father, "You may put both of my sons to death if I do not bring him back to you, if I don't bring Benjamin back to you. Entrust him to my care, and I will bring him back." Are you listening to what Reuben said? You may put both of my sons to death if I do not bring him back. So if this thing falls apart, Benjamin is not only gone, but also two of Jacob's grandsons will be gone. And it's no wonder that Jacob says, "My son will not go down there with you." Doesn't need to be made worse like that. So now consider Judah. Judah, however, convinces Jacob by offering to receive the consequences if Benjamin does not return home. So just listen to this section of scripture. But Judah said to him, "The man warned us solemnly, 'You will not see my face again unless your brother is with you.'" Judah basically says, "Dad, we can't go back there without Benjamin because he won't deal with us any longer." But then he says, "If you will send our brother along with us, we will go down and buy food for you. But if you will not send him, we will not go down, because the man said to us, 'You will not see my face again unless your brother is with you.'" Israel asked, "Why did you bring this trouble on me by telling the man you had another brother?" And Judah replies, "The man questioned us closely about ourselves and our family. 'Is your father still living?' he asked. 'Do you have another brother?'" Judah basically says, "We were just answering his questions. We weren't trying to bring trouble, but we were just asking questions." And then in verse 8, it says that Judah said to Israel, his father, "Send the boy along with me, and we will go at once, so that we and you and our children may live and not die. I myself will guarantee his safety. You can hold me personally responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all my life." And I can't help but wonder if Jacob maybe hears his own mother and the promise she made. You remember that? Jacob is in the midst of tricking his father for the birthright and for the blessing. He's dressed up as Esau. And he says to his mother, "What will happen if my father discovers it's me and he curses me?" And Rebekah said to him, "May the curse fall on me." I wonder if he maybe remembered that right here as Judah says to him, "I am willing to receive the consequences. I'm willing to receive the curse if Benjamin does not return home." And then I love in verse 10, and I just have to put this in here. Judah says to Jacob, "As it is, if we had not delayed, we could have gone and returned twice." We could have gone and been back and gone and been back if we didn't have to go through all of this with you. And then Jacob agrees to the man's, or Joseph's, terms in Genesis 43, 11 through 14. And so he gives these instructions to take some of the best products as gifts to Joseph. which a very honorable thing to do. And he agrees to send. Um, he agrees to send Benjamin because he believes Judah. And so that brings us to chapter 43, verse 16. It reads, when Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, take these men to my house, slaughter an animal, and prepare dinner. They are to eat with me at noon. And so Joseph receives his brothers, and it's in an entirely different way than they've been received previously. So when Joseph saw that Benjamin was with them, he threw a banquet for them. He had a feast for them. And it's important to note this, that they've brought these gifts to him and all of that. But I want you to see that Judah leads out in this, and the brothers are thinking that he's doing this to trick them to be all in one place. And so in verse 19 it says, they went to Joseph's steward and spoke to him at the entrance to the house. Please, sir, they said, we came down here the first time to buy food, but at the place where we stopped for the night, we opened our sacks, and each of us found his silver, the exact weight, in the mouth of the sack. So we've brought it back with us. We've also brought additional silver with us to buy food. We don't know who put the silver in our sacks. And so the way I put it in your notes is that the brothers make a confession in Genesis 43, 19 through 23. And it's really cool, the response of this steward. He says, it's all right. Don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver. And then he brought Simeon out to them. And so all of this, they've confessed, and rightfully so, they've confessed. We found that silver, our own silver, back in our packs, and we want you to understand that we didn't do this. And the steward says, it's okay. Your God put that back in there. I received your silver, which is not true, but Joseph is just not interested. This is his family. He's not interested in receiving payment from his family. And I hope that all makes sense there, that they are simply confessing, and the steward says it's okay. God is taking care of all this. All right. So verse 26 says that when Joseph came home, they presented him the gifts they had brought into him, and they bowed down before him to the ground. He asked them how they were, and then he said, how's your aged father you told me about? Is he still living? And they replied, your servant, our father, is still alive and well. And they bowed low to pay honor. As he looked about and saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about? And he said, God be gracious to you, my son. And then deeply moved, and this is the part that just gets me, the emotion of Joseph. He has every right to take revenge on his brothers, and yet that's not what he's interested in. Okay? Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. After he had washed his face, he came out and controlling himself, said, serve the food. And so they served the food, and it's interesting. The Hebrews are in one place, the Egyptians are in another place, and actually Joseph eats in his own room privately. And part of it is because to the Egyptians, they can't eat with the Hebrews because that's a detestable thing. And quite honestly, at one point, not yet, but under the law, it would be a detestable thing for the Hebrews to be eating a feast with Gentiles. Okay? And so they're all in their rightful places. The men the brothers had been seated before him in the order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest. So from Reuben clear down to Benjamin, right? And when the portions are served, notice that Benjamin is given a portion 5 times as much as the others. Now, that's a detail that sometimes is often, I think, overlooked. But why? Why is he given a portion 5 times more? because Joseph is showing him favor. You remember what the brothers did when Jacob showed Joseph favor? Joseph is beginning again it's another test of his brothers. Will they take this out on Benjamin because he's received 5 times as much? And then that 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 statement leads in. I mean, it's the very last verse of chapter 44. That lead or 43. That leads into chapter 44. And chapter 44 is entitled "A Silver Cup and a Sack." I just simply put a silver cup. And so what happens here is that Joseph gives instructions as the brothers are leaving for Canaan. Joseph instructs that a silver cup should be placed in Benjamin's pack. Okay? And so then he instructs his servants, let them get out away from here on their journey back to Canaan, just a little ways. Then I want you to go to them. And I want you to accuse of stealing my cup. It's described as being the master's cup. So he instructs that a silver cup be placed in Benjamin's pack. So they get out away, according to chapter 44, verses 1 through 15. They get out away from Joseph and his house, and a servant comes along and stops them and accuses someone of taking the cup, and they discover it in Benjamin's pack. And so this cup is described as Joseph's cup, the master's cup, chapter 44, verse 5. And it's also said to be used for divination. To be used for divination. You know, why do that? Well, because again, he's testing his brothers. Are they going to throw Benjamin under the bus like they threw Joseph under the bus? Are they going to deal with Benjamin in the same way? You know, will they allow him to be accused, to be seized by Joseph? He is testing his brothers, and so I just want to read verse 15 before we get into Judah's words. Joseph said to them, "What is this you have done? Don't you know that a man like me can find things out by divination?" And so that's the connection with this cup. He's saying, I was able to know where it was because of the cup. Now, again, divination is something that's condemned by the Hebrews later on. And Joseph, I certainly don't think was using divination. He was simply trying to give a reason of why he knew the cup was in Benjamin's pack. So now, Judah speaks again. And I just want you to know that verses 16 through 34 of Genesis chapter 44, it's so interesting. It's actually, this section is actually the longest speech in the book of Genesis, and it's Judah who gives this speech. And I want you to notice, first of all, that he confesses the brother's guilt. He says in verse 16, God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my Lord's slaves, we ourselves and the one who is found to have the cup. So do you hear what Judah is saying? We're all in this together. We've been hearing that lately with what we're facing. But that's what Judah is saying. No longer is it that this is Benjamin's problem, but Judah has grown to a point. Remember, Judah in the very beginning says, well, let's not kill him. Let's profit from this. Let's earn a little money from this. Judah has changed. You know, maybe not all of the brothers have completely changed, but Judah has changed. And here he is before Joseph, before this man, the most powerful man on the earth at this time, besides Pharaoh. And Judah confesses the brother's guilt. I don't mean he's confessing Benjamin's guilt. He's confessing their. He says, I don't know how this happened. I mean, that's what he says. But God has uncovered your servant's guilt, our guilt. Now, in verse 17, I want you to notice that Joseph wants to state, he wants to place sole blame on Benjamin. And you need to notice that. And again, it's part of the test. He says, far be it from me to do such a thing, to actually hold you all responsible. Only the man who was found to have the cup will become my slave. The rest of you go back to your father in peace. And then what we have for the remaining part of this chapter is Judah pleading with Joseph to take Benjamin's place. I mean, listen to that. He explains, listen, my father, our father, has already lost one son, his favorite son. And now if we do not bring this youngest home to him, it will be to his death. I mean, he will suffer a death of heartbreak if we don't bring him home. And he continues, and he says, I made a promise to my father, and I said, we cannot go down. Only if our youngest brother is with us will we go. We cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. And then your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore to me 2 sons. One of them went away from me, and I said, he has surely been torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to him, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in misery. And then I want to skip down to verse 33, because Judah says, I made this promise to my father. And now, please let your servant, let me remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come upon my father. And so Judah pleads with Joseph to take Benjamin's place. And it's at this point that Joseph can no longer keep his emotions in. And so Joseph reveals himself in Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 through 24. The first 4 verses are beautiful, I think. It says that then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So he's not talking about his brothers, he's talking about his attendants. Get out. Get out. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. And so Joseph is overwhelmed with emotion. He can't hold it in any longer. And so notice the response of his brothers. It just says his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. And then not only notice their response, but notice how Joseph is quick to reassure them that he doesn't mean anything evil towards them. Verse 4 says, then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. And he begins to explain all that's happened. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to prepare for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. God's providence at work. And Joseph is saying, I'm trusting in him, and you need to do the same thing. And so he tells them, man, hurry back, go back, and you can come and live here. Go and get our father, and you can come and live here. And not only that, but there's a section here, verse 16 of chapter 45. It says, when the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brothers had come, Pharaoh and all his officials were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, tell your brothers, do this. Load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land. You are directed to tell them, do this. Take some carts from Egypt for your children and your wives, and get your father and come. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all Egypt will be yours. So, Pharaoh is even on board with this. Why? Because God has placed Joseph where he wants him. And Joseph has trusted God. And now he's calling on his brothers, and he's calling on his family to trust in God as well. And so the brothers return home to prepare for the move to Egypt. That's kind of the end of the biblical part of this, but man, I've been thinking about a lot of stuff as I went through this. I've been dealing with a couple of things. We've had an individual who's passed away, and we have another who is on the verge of passing away. And so, I guess I'd ask right now that you pray for the Weddle family as Ron has died, and that you pray for the Foreman family, Bob and Regina Foreman. And I guess I've been considering some of this because in each of those situations, they're playing out in a different way. Yesterday I had the opportunity to go up and to see Bob Foreman at OSF. And OSF has kind of eased some restrictions for those who are at the end of life. And so Regina and her daughter Judy were there. And then they allowed me to go up. And then on the other hand, as I visited with Ron Weddle's family, what a different set of circumstances. For the last 7 weeks, Ron was at Colonial Manor, and the restrictions they had there was that he couldn't receive any visitors, including immediate family. So on Sunday night, I believe, Sunday evening, Vicki Weddle received a phone call from one of the nurses at Colonial Manor, and she was asking how Ron was doing, how he was doing, and the nurse simply said, well, he just passed away. And right now it seems like, doesn't it seem like right now with what we're living with the coronavirus, that not only is our life, are our lives puzzle pieces, and sometimes we understand how they connect together. In fact, I just use an illustration with Ron. It seemed like anywhere you went, if someone heard the Weddle name, they would say, well, is that any relation to Ron? And so there were all these connecting pieces, of the puzzle. But right now, doesn't it seem like as we live this life, this, whether it's, you describe it as a tapestry, and we're experiencing kind of the backside of the tapestry, which is, knots and different things. And we're not really seeing the full picture, or whether we're describing it as puzzle pieces. Right now, isn't it all kind of confusing? All the different opinions and attitudes of people, all the different perspectives. And then you come across a story in Scripture, and I hope what I put together makes sense, where the pieces of the puzzle begin to fit together because it's God who's putting them in place. And I guess just tonight, just a word of encouragement. Don't allow the jumbled mess of pieces to overwhelm you, but instead understand that God, one by one, and sometimes it's slow progress. One by one, He's putting those pieces together. He's helping us piece things together in a time that just doesn't really make sense. But we can know and understand that it's God who controls it all. So therefore, we don't allow anxiety to take over. We don't allow fear to take control or to take hold. But we simply hold on to His hand and we trust that one day all of this is going to make sense if we just simply, rest in Him. And that really, it really matches up with the title of this message, Trusting God's Providence. Trusting Him to provide, trusting Him to put us in the right position and to use us to fit into place. And that's part one of the story of Joseph. I pray that you guys are doing well. It seems like most of the people I'm talking to are really doing well. I do have to say this because I kind of painted a picture as if the Weddle family is not at peace, but they are. In fact, it's a great family of faith. They do trust God. And even though they're facing, like, for example, a visitation where no more than 10 people can be in the room, and the family can't be in the room, and they're just all sorts of rules that we're not used to. They're at peace. Same thing with the Foreman family and talking with them. They're facing the storm that is coming with God's peace. And my prayer is that we all are doing that. And so God bless you tonight. We thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to being able to do this with you here in the not so distant future. But until then, we just continue to press on, and we continue to trust God. So God bless.